about that.
Yeah, I think that that is a naturally occurring phenomenon as a consequence of our over-reliance on online dating. So we've seen that there's been an enormous shift in how people are meeting each other, at least in America. 10 years ago, 20% of couples admitted that they met each other online.
Yeah.
In the most recent year in which statistics were available, I think 2022, it's now up to over 50%. So I think that's a 250% increase in a decade, which is incredible. So most Americans are now meeting each other online.
Yeah.
Now, across that same decade, we've seen a radical decline in the number of marriages, the number of relationships being transacted, and even hooking up, which is somewhat paradoxical because on some level, it's never been easier in the history of the world to potentially find a sex or relationship partner. You just open the magic rectangle in your pocket, and there are ostensibly hundreds, if not thousands or tens of thousands of single and not so single people in your area who are looking to transact for those things. And yet fewer and fewer relationships are being transacted. So why might that be? And one of the theories that I do talk about in the book is that this is a natural consequence of perception and, let's say, supply and demand, or at least perceived supply and demand. So what happens when a man is swiping on a dating app? Well, it's just him in his own private living room. He has no intrasexual competition. He doesn't really know where he ranks relative to other men that these women might be swiping and matching. So why not believe that he's a pretty decent option for these women? Right. And it's just him and a seemingly infinite supply of women. Like, it never runs out if you're in a major metropolitan area. And so from his perception, it's a buyer's market. Yeah. There's one person, him, who's looking to transact, and a seemingly endless supply of women. So given the context of why men and women tend to enter into the sexual marketplace to begin with, which is that men attempt fundamentally to exchange resources for sexual opportunity, and women attempt to exchange their sexual opportunity for resources, given the fact that it's a buyer's market, he thinks, well, somewhere out there, there's going to be a woman who's willing to transact for sex at a lower price point. And he's right. It's just like the globalist arguments that happened, a couple decades ago under the World Trade Agreement. Yes. There's someone in the world who will do your job for less money. Yeah. That's true.
And I think the evolutionary mismatch from evolutionary psychology, like Dunbar's number, about 150 people that would live in an ancestral tribe. And you would probably have somewhere between like 6 and 8 females as a young boy that you could possibly mate with that are part of that same tribe. And now it's the point where we have like unlimited choice, and possibly the human brain was not designed to have that level of choice.
Absolutely not. Now, having too few options is a problem of itself. Like, I don't want to go back to the days where there was just 2 ladies to choose from and they could both potentially be stinky. But we need to get together because we need to survive the winter, because life is harsh and we're basically living at subsistence. Yeah. That said, we are not psychologically yet equipped to deal with at least perceived infinite optionality. Yeah. Like, as is usually the case, it takes a long time for our humanity to catch up with our technological developments. In any case, from the man's perspective, he thinks that there is a buyer's market. And so because he's trying to exchange resources for sex, he thinks that somewhere out there, there's a woman who would accept less for the same opportunity. He's right. And so that drives down the price of the proposed transaction, which leads to the fuckboy phenomenon. Because somewhere out there, there's a woman who's ready to go. And he's right.
Yeah. Yeah.
By the same token, you just flip that around for the woman. Like, the woman is there. She's in her living room. She doesn't see any other women. She doesn't know how she matches up with her intrasexual competition. So she thinks that she's probably a pretty decent option herself. And it's just her and a seemingly infinite number of men who seem very eager to transact for her sexual opportunity. So from her perspective, it's a seller's market. She's dealing with she's the only vendor in town, and there's seemingly endless customers who are trying to get through her door. So that jacks up the price of the proposed transaction. And so that leads to women basically coming out of the gate asking for a committed relationship, which is kind of nuts. I mean, I can understand why women might be offended when men just directly proposition them for sex, because those men are basically trying to get something of value for not very much at all. But the value of male commitment is so much higher than the value of an individual sexual encounter in today's sexual marketplace that it's almost ludicrous that you can come right out of the gate and expect to get that.
Yeah. Whereas a man might be asking for sex up front very quickly. And she's
Sure.
like, you did nothing to earn it. A woman is saying very early on, I want a relationship. And the man is thinking, well, you did nothing to earn it. But from her standpoint, she's like, well, I'm the woman. Have you not seen all these right swipes that I get on these dating apps? This is what my apparent value is to the other side.
Sure.
You had a question?
Yeah. I wanted to, dig into your mind about, like each person's perceived values. So because men will swipe right oftentimes a lot more than women will. Women who are like in the sexual marketplace, who are not necessarily at the top, will get significantly a lot more attention, meaning that they would value themselves more. So how do you reconcile that with the statistics where it's like, I believe it's what, 10% of men get 80% of the right swipes, and 20% of men, 10% get 60%, 20% get 80%.
Yeah, so the top 10% of men on dating apps get 63% of the right swipes. The top 20% get 83% of the right swipes. The top 40% of men get 96% of the right swipes, which is madness when you consider it. And women find 80% of men on these dating apps to be unattractive, and only 4.5% so attractive that they would actually pursue. So if you're in that top 4.5% of men, dating apps are fantastic for you. Like you said, hookup culture, fuckboy phenomenon. It's only those men that are part of that hookup culture. Even Mac and Murphy was talking about the bottom third of men do not get to really participate in the short-term hookup culture for whatever reason. They may be too short or too broke. Scott Galloway had a great point. It's like women are not interested in mating with broke men. Like that seems to be the number one facilitator. And I also was reading one story where they were talking about the likelihood of going a year without sex. And one of the highest precipitators was living at home, being underemployed or unemployed was one of the highest precipitators of women not choosing you at all.
Yeah.
Anyway, you were saying?
No. So my question is, how do you reconcile that in your research? Because if, 50% of people are getting on relationships through apps, but only a certain number of men are actually getting matches, how does that that almost seems like contradictory in a way.
Help me understand that a little bit better. What's the contradiction? So
if only less than 40% of men are actually getting matches at all, do you feel that basically there are a lot of men who are actually higher value, but their perceived value of themselves are lower, and then women have a higher perceived value than they actually are, and that's where that dichotomy is coming from?
Okay, so that can certainly be the case. So I think that you have to approach dating apps like a tool, and you have to learn how to use the tool in order to operate it successfully. If you don't know how to use a dating app, it's going to feel absolutely infuriating.
Yes.
It's going to feel hopeless that you'll ever meet anyone for anything. This can be both from a man's perspective and a woman's perspective. And for a man to use a dating app successfully, he has to use it as a massive action tool, because there's no way around that. Given those numbers, the only way that you can improve the likelihood of ever entering into any kind of sexual relationship as a man on an app is to throw out so many different lines that in the aggregate, you eventually cross some sort of probability threshold, and somebody is willing to give you a chance.
Absolutely.
Right.
The other thing that I really loved, you actually said this when you're on whatever podcast, was the concept of sexual marketplace value, which a lot of people find this term offensive. The concept that someone can have a marketplace value, but there has to be some value. If you were to stratify 1 million people based on their dating apps or their physical appearance, there is a point where someone is in the mean and someone is out at 1 or 2 standard deviations. What you said I thought was brilliant, because this is the best way I've heard it described, because this is one of the most controversial topics that people have. It's who is willing to get into a committed relationship with you. So your definition, and women don't like this concept because they'll believe my market value is based on how many master's degrees that I've earned and what my income is, as opposed to understanding, no, as a man, my value is based on the woman that is willing to commit to me. And as a woman, your sexual market value is based on the man that is willing to commit to you. Those men that you right swipe or you left swipe on dating apps, often these women will think, well, because I left swipe on them, I could get any of these men to commit to me, not recognizing these men are here for short-term sexual access. In fact, that's what the majority of these dating apps are for, is short-term sexual access. And so they'll think, because this man was willing to give me short-term sexual access, therefore I could easily get him to commit, and therefore my sexual market value is here, whatever I define it to be, as opposed to coming to recognition is you're single for a reason, and that is because the men that you chose were not willing to commit to you. And so could you go a little bit more into that? I thought that definition was perfect.
Sure. I mean, you did a pretty good job already. So sexual marketplace value is a really touchy topic, but everybody uses it, at least with respect to their own decisions in the sexual marketplace. When your friends tell you that you could do better, that's them using sexual marketplace value as a quantity, if not as a discrete value. But it's still the understanding that some people are better options for you than others, and that your optionality is related to the perceived value of your customers, the opposite sex, basically. Right? So I do talk about the fact that it can be really touchy because it's very hard to say like what a high value man or a woman is, because no matter what you say, there's going to be somebody out there, and let's even assume that they're being genuine and honest here, who says, you know, money isn't actually important to me. I mean, I'm sure you hear that all the time from women, right? And I don't know if that, I don't think that that's true in all cases that that's being said. It's certainly socially unacceptable to be too mercenary about that from a woman's perspective.
Sure.
But let's assume that there are some women out there who said, height don't matter to me. Money doesn't matter to me. Looks don't matter to me. And they might be right. But that's the difference between individual preference and, let's say, populational preferences at the population level. Okay. So I do talk about number of different sexual marketplace values in the book. There's normalized, perceived, and transacted. And so what you're talking about is transacted sexual marketplace value. On some level, nothing has a value until the point of sale.
Yes.
And no one really knows how much something is worth until someone is willing to put their money on the table and say, it's worth this much. And if you accept that money, you agree that it's worth that much. If you accept
you
less,
reinforce that value.
You reify the value, you bring it into existence. It didn't exist before you accepted that value. If you took less, it would have been worth less. If you held out and eventually received more, it would be worth more. But it's always worth exactly what is being transacted. Okay. Now, given the fact that men are the gatekeepers of commitment and women are the gatekeepers of sex, the transacted sexual marketplace value is gendered between men and women, in the sense that you have to measure a person's point of sale against what is more difficult for them to receive. Since women are the gatekeepers of sex, it's certainly no big thing for them to open their gate at will. It's much harder for them to get the other side to open their gate. And so that's how we have to measure, let's say, their success rate in the marketplace, and vice versa for men. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
100%.